So our next step is to jump into our main.ts file. Now the reason for this is because we need to pass in our providers for our application component. Now if you have a look at the signature for our Bootstrap application function, we have this optional options object, which allows an application config. This then returns us a promise. As we know, if things error, we then have our nice catch statement, which kicks into play. Now for this, we need to jump in after our app component, add a comma and some curly brackets, and we can then start to add some properties. So the first one that we're going to add is our providers. And you can see here that we have this list of providers that should be available to the root component and all of its children. So in this sense, this is where we want to, instead of using our app module, where we have our routing configuration, which is passed in as the router module for root, which we know is how we can then pass in our entire routing construct. We want to essentially move this routing away from the Angular module and pass it into our providers, which are then going to make it fully accessible in our application. Now for this, we need to import our router module. So go ahead and hit enter. We then have this router module that's then included. And just like before, we would do for child and for root. Obviously, because this is the app component, we want to use our for root. So this is where we're going to then pass in our application roots for the root of our project. Now, like in our app module, we've called them the roots. What I'm going to do is call these the app roots. And then we're going to, instead of our app module, we're in fact going to use this just to purely hold our routing definitions. So here we're going to call this the app roots. So instead of our app.module, and this is a convention that I've come up with, is just to rename this to app.roots and just have its own file dedicated to our routing definitions, which means that we don't really need any of this. The only thing that we do need is the type definition for our Angular roots. So I'm going to go ahead and remove everything that we don't need. So we end up with this really nice import roots. It's then typed. We have our app root constant, all our routing definitions, and then we can simply eradicate our ng module. So this is nice and clean, as you can see. We can save this out. We then have our app roots. So we then need to go and access our app root. So if we delete it and then type it again, you can see that we can then automatically import that definition. So this keeps things nice and separate. We don't need to use modules anymore for holding our root definitions. We can keep a nice clean file. However, at the minute we're seeing an error. Now if we hit save, you can see that we have type module with providers, router module, is not assignable to type provider, imported ng module providers. So what does this mean? It means that we need to use a special function provided to us from the Angular core package that allows us to just import the providers from the router module. So if we go and start typing before our router module and start adding import providers from, you can see that we have this new function from Angular core, import providers from, which collects providers from all ng modules and standalone components. Providers extracted via import providers from are only usable in an application injector or another environment injector, such as a root injector. They should not be used in component providers. So essentially, we want to import our import providers from, which comes from our Angular core package above. So make sure that's imported for you. And we essentially want to pass in our router module definition, where we then pass in our router module for root. So when we save this out, we're then back to square one, where we are now seeing just an error for our router outlet. We can then, of course, go back to our app component, get rid of our router outlet, and things work as you'd expect. We then have a standalone component being used. Now, the difference here is we have this admin/donuts. So if I go ahead and delete the roots, you can see that, again, it's redirecting to admin/donuts. But because we're not using a router outlet, nothing is in fact rendering. So the great thing here is our router is now fully working because remember we've created this if the path is empty. We want to then redirect to our admin, and for all other routes do the exact same thing. So we're going to wrap it up here for this lesson. we have our app component, which at the minute is having some problems with our router outlet. So we're going to work out how to go ahead and fix this. But in this lesson, we have covered using this providers and importing the providers from the router module to allow us to then inject some of the built-in Angular modules, because of course the router module is not a component. And this also applies to some other built-in Angular modules. And as I mentioned, NG modules are not going away anytime soon. This is just a standalone approach for the time being, and how to achieve a fully standalone application. We've then refactored our app.module into an app.routes. We then have a very nice and clean app routes file with just a routing definition, a nice constant that's exported, and absolutely nothing else. So with this in mind, let's dive into the next video and keep refactoring and learning about how we can build a fully standalone Angular app.